It's a real pleasure to be here. I thank the organizers for the invitation to come. As Maria said, I'm trained as a cell biologist, so I was a little surprised to get an invitation to come to a conference of computer scientists and physicists. But I hope that the experiences that I will describe to you from my career will resonate with some of the things that are also happening in the field of computer science and physics. So anyway, I wanted to share with you some thoughts about a topic that's very important to me, cultural diversity. And I wanted to start really by telling you what the major take-home messages are from the talk today. So there are 2 points that I want to really raise, and I hope we'll have a chance to discuss these during the panel. And the first is that if you really want to be an excellent institution, an excellent department, the way to achieve excellence is through diversity. And this is not the way we usually think about diversity. We usually think that in order to maintain our excellence, we may, in fact, compromise it by becoming more diverse. But the research has shown that really diversity increases creativity, it increases our innovation, and that is the way to be excellent, is by being diverse. The second point that I want to make is that in order to maximize the benefits of diversity, one has to be culturally competent. And that is that institutions need to provide opportunities for faculty and staff to develop cultural competence. You simply can't do it by osmosis. You have to do something active. That is to really understand other cultural perspectives and to become culturally aware. So professional development opportunities for faculty and staff are important if institutions are going to develop individuals who are culturally competent and aware. So scientists must really appreciate that science is a social construct, that we operate in a social environment. That is, we depend upon professional networks, our collaborations, these are all social interactions. We depend upon trust among each other. We depend upon ethical conduct. And these are all social components of our environment. And so science is a social construct. Science is not neutral to cultural diversity. We have to really understand how others think about and prioritize these sorts of issues. And so cultural diversity matters. So these are the 2 points that I'm hoping I can shed a little bit of light on as we go through the talk today. So most of the comments that I will make on this issue actually comes from an article that was written by Catherine Phillips and published in Scientific American. And I encourage you to read this article because it's very, very good. It provides a lot of references and I think is excellent. Scientific American republished this article in 2016 after the most recent presidential election because of the realization that diversity was going to have a tough ride over the next few years. So what is the upside of diversity? When I'm talking about diversity in this case, the social categories that I'm referring to are race, ethnicity, gender, and sexual orientation. Those are the areas that I wanted to cover today. And there are now decades of social science research that provides an answer to the question that diversity enhances our creativity. So if we look at things like in scientific research, this is work that was published by Freeman and Wang, who show that if you look at metrics like citations and impact factors of papers, that groups that are diverse, that are socially diverse, they have more citations and higher impact factors for papers than written by those who are from the same ethnic group. So there's an immediate benefit of having a diverse group working on a particular project. Organizational scientists have shown for companies that diverse groups are more innovative. They are more able to bring about new inventions and the ability to commercialize those inventions into products and services. So again, a benefit of socially diverse groups. Socially diverse groups are better at problem solving, especially when these problems are complex, multidimensional, non-routine. Socially diverse groups are much better at solving those problems. And diversity forces us to prepare better. When you are having to work with a group, a diverse group, you tend to think more critically about what and how you present your ideas. It gets away from groupthink. If everybody in the room thinks the same way, you often don't interrogate the assumptions under the arguments that you're making. So another key benefit of having a socially diverse group. So this is, in fact, how diversity works. It promotes hard work and creativity by encouraging the consideration of alternatives even before any interpersonal interactions take place. So organizations need to be diverse, teams, organizations, society, in order to be best at growth and change. So the question then becomes, why do we resist group diversity? And the research has shown that social diversity in a group can cause discomfort, rough interactions, a lack of trust, greater perceived interpersonal conflict, lower communication, less cohesion, more concern about disrespect. And that's why the point I was making at the outset is that in order to optimize the benefit of diversity, you have to become culturally aware and culturally competent. So if you do that, then these problems do not arise in diverse groups. So institutions have a responsibility to make sure that faculty and staff are, in fact, made to be culturally competent and culturally aware. So let me move on to the second piece of the talk, and that is the fact that diversity is not achieved by adding one underrepresented minority member to a department. And that has been my experience for my entire career. So my career spans 4 decades, and I worked at Research One universities through my career. And in that case, I've always been the only one in my department and the only one in the school or college. It's not just in my department. So this is a real problem. It really doesn't provide a real change, a creation of a diverse working group. So as I said, I am a cell biologist, so I am familiar with the data in the biomedical sciences, and over the past 15 to 20 years, we've worked very hard to increase the number of underrepresented minority PhDs produced per year. And over this period of time, that increase has been about 9-fold. So there has really been an uptick in the number of students being trained. But if you look at the number of hires, of assistant professors who have been hired in departments, in medical schools and in biology departments, that number has only increased by 2.5-fold. So it really isn't a supply problem. There are individuals out there who are trained. The problem really lies in the way we hire faculty. So there's a tendency to use a very restricted definition of the kinds of individuals that we're looking for, and as a result, search committees often do not come up with underrepresented minority candidates in the pool. And so until we change the way we actually define excellence and look for faculty and value diversity, then we will continue to have this problem of very few being hired at our institutions. So being the only one is very difficult. And I speak from personal experience. It is impossible to really change institutional culture when you are the only one. You have very little impact if you are one in a department of 20 or 30 faculty members, or as I say, one in a school or college of 100 or 200 faculty members. It is also very difficult for the faculty member when the environment is not culturally responsive and affirming. So you feel very much culturally isolated, and survival is really at issue here. And how does one survive? The problem is that many do not. So there are quite a few underrepresented minorities who take faculty positions but often decide that this is not an environment in which they can survive, and they leave the profession. So that's an unfortunate side effect. So what are the reasons to tough it out? Why did I decide that I would stay in spite of the fact that I was the only one in the department? And it's because I really wanted to have a successful career. I knew that I needed to be at a research university that had state-of-the-art equipment and the infrastructure, and that I would have access to excellent graduate students and postdocs. And of course, the prestige and reputation of universities influences one's ability to get grant funding from NIH and NSF, as well as for my own professional growth. So those were the major reasons for being willing to live in this environment. But there was a fourth one that was very, very important to me, and that was a moral obligation to right a wrong, to walk through a door that was closed to generations of black scientists before me. So I was very willing to tolerate a lot of discomfort to make sure that we continue to try to change the way our institutions think about diversity. So the costs are high to stay the course. You have to learn to work in cultural isolation. And since scientists spend long hours in their labs and in their work environment, to be culturally isolated means that you can really feel pretty lonely. So you also have to learn how to code switch. You have to move out of your own cultural area into the space, the cultural space of the dominant culture around you. And this is also a very challenging situation to be in, because you have to learn how to deflect microaggressions, insensitive statements, insults, and attitudes of cultural and racial superiority. This is not a very comfortable thing to have to deal with on a daily basis. And so you also have to recognize that you are not the problem. And this is one of the secrets to my own success. You often feel as an underrepresented minority that because you are the one who's the target of these microaggressions, that there must be something wrong with you. But once you realize it's not your problem, it's really your colleague's problem. And furthermore, you have to realize that it's not your responsibility to correct that. And once you make that realization, then you can avoid the emotion of anger, which is the other very downside of being in an environment in which you are the only one. So you have to work out a way to make sure that you don't become angry in the situation in which you find yourself. And finally, you have to master this concept known as double consciousness. I don't know if you've heard of this. But for African Americans, we know that we are perceived as being less than or being less capable, especially in the sciences. And so we are always looking at ourselves from someone else's perspective, knowing that they feel that we are less capable, when we know inside of ourselves that we are just as capable as our white colleagues. And so this is a concept, double consciousness, that was actually introduced by the great sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois in 1903 in the book that he wrote, his now famous book, The Souls of Black Folks. And this is the definition of double consciousness. It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels this two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body, who dogged strength alone keep it from being torn asunder. So this concept is something that one has to understand and understand how it operates so that you can maintain your own sense of pride and self-worth and sense of dignity. So again, if you are unable to internalize and understand how these things work, it makes it extremely difficult to survive in such an environment. So what else? What are the other factors that are critical in being able to work in such an environment? Social science literature is rich with information about how these social interactions work in the workplace. And so as an African American, I've had to make myself aware of these concepts. And the privilege of being white is that you don't have to worry about it because you are part of the dominant culture. But I have to make myself aware of these concepts. Otherwise, it would be very difficult to operate on a day-to-day basis. So I have to understand white identity and the concept of white privilege. I have to understand the concept of white fragility. This is a concept where it's very difficult often for whites to talk about race. And if you try to engage them in a conversation about race, they often get flustered and have difficulty with the conversation. And this concept is called white fragility, not having to deal with the concept and having difficulty emotionally talking about it. Microaggressions, this concept that you often hear comments being made to make you realize that you're part of a marginalized group, you don't belong, that you are the other. Stereotype threat, which is another very, very debilitating concept. The threat of a negative stereotype when I'm interacting with someone who assumes that I am less than, I'm having to deal with the threat of confirming that negative stereotype. And when I do that, I'm using the cognitive resources in my brain to deal with the threat, and it takes away my ability to do my best. So you have to understand how that concept works. Implicit bias, we all know that we have implicit biases. And even a name that sounds African American can result in fewer callbacks when resumes are submitted. Oops, sorry. And social capital, another concept that's extremely important. Again, the ability to form a professional network becomes much more of a challenge for underrepresented minorities. And I must say that the way that I've gotten around some of those problems is interacting with international scientists. I have very close collaborations with friends from Germany and from France and from Italy, and quite often individuals who have not been socialized in this country have a much easier time of being part of a professional network with underrepresented minorities. And self-efficacy, the maintaining one's own sense that you can do it, that you can survive in this kind of an environment. So in addition to all of these factors, as a black male, I have to also worry about other kinds of issues that are negatively associated with being black and male. Blacks can never project, black males can't project strength, because if you project strength, you are considered to be threatening. So you can project dignity. This is what President Obama did. He was very successful at this. Projecting strength is a very difficult thing. You are thought to be threatening or angry. So you have to modulate your voice and make sure you don't create environments that appear threatening, never show anger. And I learned that I never take equipment out of a building without a white escort. Because a plant was delivered to my office, and I was going to take it home one evening. I was stopped by one of the staff members in the building who called security saying that a black man was stealing a plant from the building, even after I told him that I was a professor in the physiology department. So you have to learn how to deal with these situations that occur when you are an underrepresented minorities. So you develop awareness and knowledge of the factors that could impede your progress. You also have to understand the social science of cultural competence and inclusive excellence. And remember that historically white institutions remain underprepared to support underrepresented minority groups. So I'm going to end with a bit of my own family history to let you know a little bit about who I am. So we can trace my family history back to my great-great-grandfather, whose name was James Langford. He was born in 1805. He was born a slave. And we don't know very much about his parents, but we do know that he learned to read and write. And I don't know if you know this, but it was against the law to teach a slave to read and write. So we're not sure how he learned to read and write, but what we do know is that he was hired by the local white farmers to teach their children how to read and write. And so he earned enough money to buy his freedom in 1850. And so he became a free man, and he bought the freedom after his freedom, the freedom of his wife and his children. He had enough money to purchase land to buy a small farm. He donated lots to the community to build a school and a church, and that's the school and the church that I went to as a child. So my grandfather is the first in my family to be born free, and I'm the first to attend a historically white institution and earn the PhD. So the greatest gift from my great-great-grandfather was that if he could find a way to earn money to buy his freedom, to jumpstart a life out of slavery, then surely I could use that gift to become a scientist. And the sustaining benefit of the gift is that science belongs to me, that I own science, and as my great-great-grandfather owned freedom. So my American cultural roots are very deep. I'm very proud of the fight for freedom that represents my cultural background, the fight, to end slavery, the abolitionist movement, the fight to end Jim Crow and segregation, the civil rights movement, movements that made it possible to elect a black president, Barack Obama. So institutional culture change is really needed, and we know that when culturally aware programs are in place at historically white institutions, that persistence increases. That is both for students as well as for faculty and staff, that performance improves. And this is a long-term process that has to take place. So we have to be prepared for a long term. The perceived wisdom was that it would be something that we could accomplish in one generation, but that is not true. This is something that will take a very long time for us to accomplish. If we look, for example, at the comment made by Justice Sandra Day O'Connor when the University of Michigan case was brought on affirmative action, she said, "We expect that 25 years from now, the use of racial preferences will no longer be necessary to further the interests of student diversity approved today." Well, of course, we know that that is not true. And as a matter of fact, when Justice Anthony Kennedy reviewed the case brought against the University of Texas, he made no mention of the eventual disappearance of affirmative action. And so we know that this is a long-term process. It is not something that is going to happen in one generation. So when historically white institutions do the hard work to develop culturally aware campuses that celebrate and affirm the rich cultural heritage of underrepresented minority groups, then we receive the benefit of cultural diversity. And the social science literature has generated a body of literature on how we can do this and why it is very important. So, in conclusion, it's hard work. It's not going to happen without some real work on the part of everyone. You really will have to examine your white identity and your white privilege. You will have to examine the priority of your culture over others. And if we do the hard work, the benefits of diversity are enormous, and one is not enough. Thank you.
I would like to take questions from the audience before we move to the panel. Maybe
Thank you very much. I'm really very happy that you came and you gave this speech.
Thanks.
Yeah, I'm a group analyst in the other part of my life, and I wanted to add a group analyst perspective to this. It is simplifying, but it can shed some light. Sometimes it's just a problem of group identification. If you identify your group as the American male white Caucasian population, it is absolutely true that any kind of affirmative action is a threat against your group because you have less post, less position, less. So you fight against everybody else. If you identify yourself as part of the human population inhabiting planet Earth, any kind of inclusiveness, it increases the chances of the human population to survive because, of course, I mean, you don't squander intellectual potential and so on, and creativity, as you rightly said. So what is the difference? Well, the difference comes really what you call the cultural awareness. If you are culturally aware, or if your psychosocial and moral development is a certain point, you can identify yourself with the human population. The point is that in that case, what your enemy is injustice, justice, racism, discrimination, and these are very difficult enemies to fight because they're abstract.
Right.
So below a certain threshold, and below and threshold are two concepts that one should define, it's much easier to hate the neighbor because he's black, because he's a woman, because of whatever, I mean, color, race, religion, political faith, and so on. And in that sense, and this may explain some form of resistance to inclusiveness.
Well, you know, these are very good points, and I appreciate the concept of if we could deal with racism and injustices and discrimination. I think that's fine. The problem is that the way it operates in society is group identity. Unfortunately, that is the way we sort of think of ourselves. And until we are at a point where people are willing to examine how they think of their own identity, we're not going to be able to deal with the more abstract issues that you raise, like, racism, wherever it exists, or injustices, and being willing to understand that you don't want to squander opportunities that everybody, there's a potential that all groups bring to the table. But until we can get past some of the more the mundane aspects of racial identity, I think it's going to be hard to make those arguments. Yeah. Was there another question? Yes, Gordon.
Keep forgetting, even though I'm the one. It's my fault. Thank you for the talk. That was quite informative. So I'm here at the University of Washington, a really large institution, and part of a science department. Which, I saw your number increase in hiring of faculty of 2.5 times. Our physics department is nowhere near that increase. So the institution as a whole has put in place a number of things to try and improve the hiring of underrepresented minorities. These are mostly along the lines of making searches more open and transparent. But when it comes down to the decision, you still have conversations and you can still hear overtones like, oh, this person needs more mentoring than that person, whereas really that probably has more to do with a stereotype than it does with anything real. And it's always struck me that most people are quite happy to and will agree to the logical argument that we need a more open search or whatever the procedural changes that might improve things. But when it comes down to it, changing the attitude, having a conversation about the stereotypes that people hold and how they apply them in situations like that, that seems to be missing from a lot of what's done at large institutions. So I was wondering, in your experience at the various R1 places you've been at, if there have been things that have been done in departments to maybe make that as big as 2.5, and I understand that that's not big enough, but it's bigger than many places, really work. And if there are conversations or other things that you think would be beneficial to other places around the country who are attempting to improve.
Yeah, very good question. So there are a couple of things that I would say have been very effective in helping departments sort of become more culturally aware. I work with the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, and they have a program in which they provide fellowships to graduate students, underrepresented minority graduate students. And the mentors of those students are required to come to a 2-day workshop on mentoring. And the workshop is actually run by a couple of professional social scientists who can talk about the issues and really get individuals to think through their own biases and how they perceive other groups. And so this has been very, very successful because what it does is to get people to share their stories. They begin to talk, as I shared mine. They begin to share their stories. And then that process actually helps them to begin to think about and be more culturally aware. So I think if you did just things like that, just having regular meetings of your faculty in which you are willing to share your stories and talk about these issues and really think deeply about the value of diversity, then I think you can begin to see some changes within the department. So that's one thing that I've seen. And there are others in which there are faculty learning communities in which you have individuals who learn about some of these issues and bring them back and serve as trainers for other members of the department. So there are things that are not very expensive to put into place that I think can help faculty to become more culturally aware. But I should also say that it's hard for single individual faculty members. So if you wanted to do this in your department and it was not part of a departmental or college, program, then I think it would be very difficult to make the change. So it really does have to be an institutional culture change to really make this work. Yeah.
So I think that the issue of cultural diversity is very important. I mean, I know that I actually have more in common with most of my colleagues than my neighbors down the street. So I'd like to ask a question. How many people in this room have at least one parent with a university education? If you do, can you raise your hand? Okay, so what fraction of Americans have university education of adults aged 25 to 34?
The numbers are, I don't know, 15, 20%?
I think in this generation, I think it's closer to 30 or 35%.
Okay.
But still a small minority. So let me ask another question. How many have at least one parent who has, say, university-level education in science or technology? So I think one of the issues, and let me ask you to expound on this, is that people tend to judge people like themselves more favorably. And I think that academics tend to judge people who come from well-educated families more favorably, independent of their abilities. And it's partly just a question of style. I don't think I think what goes under the form of implicit bias. And so in your family, I have the idea that education has been highly valued for many generations.
Yes.
And do you think that's been a benefit for you personally?
Right.
Has that made it easier for you to participate in an academic world?
Right. But I'm first generation in going to college, even though education was always very important in the family. But those opportunities weren't available, right? And as I said, I was the first to earn a PhD in my family. And so I think your comment is correct, that we tend to select others who are like ourselves or who have come from an educated background. But that is a bias. I mean, it really is. It's what prevents us from looking more broadly and defining what we would like to think of as inclusive excellence. It's not just about looking at those parameters, those metrics. We're looking at a broader set of metrics of what really constitutes excellence. And it's only when we do that that we can begin to bring in groups that are different from ourselves. And that's a very important change.
I know there are questions for a little late. I would like to start with the panel. So you please hold your questions for later during the panel. So I would like to thank Dr.
Thank you.